The World We Create, From God to Market, by Tomas Björkman, read by Mark Meadows. Introduction to Part 2. We have now taken a sweeping view of history to illustrate how a developmental perspective of billions of years can help us see patterns that are often lost in conventional historiography. We saw how the evolution of the physical universe, life, and human culture has unfolded through a number of successive, often highly contingent developments that have led to higher and higher levels of complexity. At critical junctures, we could chart our entry onto the scene as a conscious animal, the storytelling ape that we are, and onwards as the collective agent of powerful purpose, the creator of collective imaginaries, and transmitter of cultural and mimetic forces. We have familiarized ourselves with the four thought perspectives that have arisen during human history, the four fundamental frameworks for our interpretation and understanding of the world: animism, religion, rationalism, and postmodernism. Through its symbol tools, every thought perspective becomes its own collective imaginary, which is both held aloft by culture and dominates it. What is central in such a collective imaginary is an important idea that some sociologists call the imaginary's fundamental authority. This fundamental idea authorizes and legitimizes the imaginary and functions as its anchoring foundation stone and its arbiter. The three most important such idea inventions in human history have, in my view, been God, science, and the market, ideas that we have been able to use to efficiently structure our existence and our symbol worlds. They have also been the foundation for and have legitimized the dominating thought perspectives throughout human history. Thus, we have three thought perspectives, each with their own fundamental authority. 1. The religious thought perspective, with God as its highest fundamental authority. 2. The rational thought perspective, with science as its highest fundamental authority. 3. The postmodern thought perspective, with the market as its highest fundamental authority. For religion, God, karma, or similar ideas were not just the primary explanatory principle for occurrences in the world, but also a way to legitimize religion's dominant role in society. Those who claimed to have God on their side were also the ones who had the right to exercise power. In modern society, science was used in a similar way. Hence, it was no coincidence that the institutions of science were subordinate to the state and often were formed as part of government's attempts to legitimize themselves. In relation to large parts of the population, it was not so much a case of their critical relation to science's methods or results being decisive, but rather a reference to the scientific institutions that decided whether a certain act was right or wrong. This, however, started to erode as a greater part of the population attained a more critical level of awareness. With postmodernism's victory within both academia and popular culture, science and the rational thought perspective increasingly started to lose their legitimacy as pillars of society. But with postmodernism's inherent tendency to fight and critically explore all authorities, the unintended consequence was that when there were no higher authorities, the ethical legitimacy was handed over to the power of the market. In Part 2, we will explore where this civilizational trajectory into contemporary late modernity leaves us today, while demonstrating how our mimetic systems of symbols have arrived at arguably rather suboptimal equilibria. The victories of professional doubt, leading to ubiquitous cynicism, threaten to abandon our imaginaries to the market alone. At severe risk of absconding from our responsibilities to enhance fairness and forge meaning, we risk sleepwalking into a neoliberal world devoid of those concepts, all for the sake of efficiency. I hope the listener will discover just how contingent our sense of selves is, and even how contingent the market is. Instead of taking their solidity as articles of faith, we can deploy the lessons learned in Part 1 to question the roots of these systems and redirect ourselves towards new dawns. With this picture of a socially constructed, subconsciously qualified, interconnected and evolving self, we can more soberly address our shortcomings in decision and meaning-making faculties. Furthermore, by extending these systemic insights to the world at large, we can both surrender some of our excessive expectations of command and control and also learn to manage and regulate our role in self-eco-organization far more effectively, with needed restraint and wisdom. A crucial element of Part 2's analysis is the social construction of our reality. It is pivotal to appreciate the contingency and malleability of the aforementioned systemic developments, which we observe and concede include sizable failings when uncritically arrived at with certain social norms, for example, current free market fundamentalism. Part 2 will show that much of our current political discourse and economic activity lacks the self-reflection that we saw was so crucial at each iterative step in Part 1. Therefore, a conscious reflexivity towards our own systems, shifting the sacred subject and secularizing it, removing it from its pedestal into a manipulable object, is key. Chapter 7. The Postmodern Thought Perspective. The discussion about postmodernism has been going on since the early 1980s. Among those who consider it a valid concept, it is commonly agreed that it is not just a diagnosis of our age, but also a critical mode of thought that questions many of the general assumptions of modernity, and that it is a way of showing alternative routes to knowledge. In my interpretation, it is even more than that. It is a whole new thought perspective, the latest of its kind. Nietzsche once wrote that there are no facts in themselves. It is always necessary to begin by introducing a meaning in order that there can be a fact. Facts do not exist by themselves. There is no view from nowhere, as pointed out by Thomas Nagel, from where we objectively can observe them. Facts always depend on the context in which they are situated, and contexts can always be put into question. This simple idea sums up what, according to Callum G. Brown, make up the two core principles of postmodernity, that 1. Reality is unrepresentable in human forms of culture, and 2. With an inability to represent reality, no authoritative account can exist of anything. By unrepresentable, Brown does not mean that we cannot create representations of reality, merely that our representations will never fully correspond with what they are portraying. Postmodernism accordingly entails a deep skepticism about any authoritative accounts of ultimate and unquestionable truths, especially those of science, the highest authority in the modern thought perspective. The foundation of postmodern epistemology is thus the key intellectual principle that the notion of truth cannot be verified through empirical research, but that all knowledge is context-dependent and therefore ultimately unreliable. It does not mean that we cannot make any meaningful accounts of reality, but what it brings to our awareness is that we need to remain highly critical to any truth claims and remember that our narratives about reality are severely limited and can never fully capture what they make representations of. First of all, because reality is too enormous and complex to be truly representable. Second, because it requires subjectivity that can always be put into question. And third, because our representations of reality are limited by human signs which are not equivalent to the facts being conveyed themselves. Although many of us do not have a sufficient understanding of postmodernism or have even heard about the term, most of us are familiar with postmodern expressions and elements from popular culture. Postmodern art is characterized by accepted rules being abandoned and replaced by an admixture of old and new, high and low, and a creative playfulness where more or less anything goes. It also emphasizes surfaces, absurdity, and the apparent lack of profound meaning in modern life, often in a dystopian way. A good example is Andy Warhol, who shows us that fine art and popular culture are not so different from one another, and that surfaces and appearances within contexts are all that really matter. His triptychs and paintings indicate that mundane and popular things, such as images of canned tomato soup or Marilyn Monroe repeatedly drowned in shrieking colours, can also be fine art, because there is really nothing behind the curtains, no depth or secret to reveal, nothing special about the artist and his artwork. Postmodernism sees through all such illusions. There is only surface. And you can play with these surfaces in irreverent ways. Pablo Picasso, who was more postmodern than modern in a strict sense, squeezes several dimensions and multiple perspectives into the same two-dimensional frame. In postmodernism's cynical optics, there is nothing other than how they immediately appear. No deeper purpose or meaning is to be found behind the surfaces, and here the symbols are given a prominent place as the only thing our mental world consists of, beyond which there is nothing that we can acquire knowledge of. Only surface, context, absurdity, which can be seen as a criticism of the idea in earlier thought perspectives that there is a kind of inherent essence within phenomena. In early forms, this postmodern current first showed up in late 19th century literature. You may remember the Wizard of Oz, who, upon being revealed as a fraud, points out to Dorothy that he is not a bad man, only a bad wizard. Or Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, in which the stupefying dialogues reveal the absurd and contingent nature of speech and language. Most of us have probably been exposed to postmodernism without knowing it from the films we have seen. For example, David Lynch's Blue Velvet, 1986, where there are strange happenings that cannot be grasped by one's reason, such as a blind man who can see, or an ear in the grass. There are constant shifts in pace and tone, and normal reality is distorted and presented as something ambiguous and unknown. Lynch also created Twin Peaks, 1990, which contains many of the same elements. Other examples of postmodern films are Pulp Fiction, 1994, a story with a non-linear timeline where clichés from the gangster, drama and comedy genres are playfully mixed with surf music and pop culture to attain something unique without actually offering anything new of its own. Another example is Blade Runner, 1982, a dystopic, futuristic vision with anthropomorphic robots and without easily recognizable villains and heroes. Dystopias that warn of technology's dark sides, i.e. modernity, rather than science fiction utopias that celebrate the conquests of science, are a common feature in postmodern films. Postmodern architecture can be seen in the building styles in Las Vegas, as pointed out by Frederick Jameson. What is striking as one moves down the strip is a completely free blend of styles that have been adopted from various cultures and epochs. A good example is the Las Vegas Hotel Aladdin, which on the outside is of Arab and on the inside English Tudor style. It is a revolt against modernism's rules and requirements for boundaries and order. Architectural modernism is stylistically pure and hierarchical, while postmodernism emphasizes style blends where all elements are given equal value. The postmodernists are not claiming to be offering something new, rather, their originality consists of a creative mix of already existing elements and methods. Postmodernism is a remix culture where sampling, breaking up, and stirring are applauded. Along the strip we can also find buildings that have become wedding chapels for quick nuptials with garish neon signs. The sign, rather than the building itself, which might as well have been a convenience store or a warehouse, is what defines its function. Symbols are more important than what they refer to in postmodern thinking. That the neon signs often are larger than the buildings they refer to, thus make the city of Las Vegas particularly postmodern, according to Jameson. As such, we can regard this city as a society that in its postmodern state has lost the ability to handle time and history and the ability to value one thing higher than another. However, one thing does count above everything else: money. A helpful way to understand postmodernism is by contrasting it with modernism. Sometimes it is easier to get a sense of something by reference to what it is not and how it differs from something else, preferably its opposite. And in the case of postmodernism, we are fortunate to have an opposite within the concept's very name. Postmodernism is derived from modernism. It is, as such, not a sudden departure from the thought perspective that preceded it, but emerged as an answer to many of the inherent flaws and contradictions of the modern, rational thought perspective. The logics and principles of postmodernism can thus be traced back to the premises that guided modern thought. With modernism as our point of departure, we can thereby identify some of the principles that came to shape postmodern thought. On a philosophical level, modernism folds over to its own premises in a number of ways. For instance, if we have to be rational and consequential, then we must also accept rational arguments about society, science, politics, and everyday life. In particular, that many of our societal relations and structures are extremely skewed and imbalanced and not as rational as they could have been. From a rational point of view, we must simply admit that modern society has not created the just and harmonious conditions envisioned by the Enlightenment, and that science and progress has not solely been of the good. Furthermore, if we accept that truth can only be known by intersubjective verification, which after all is the basis of objective scientific reasoning, then we must also accept that the premises of the intersubjective social context must be accounted for as well. For instance, if we accept that the truth is explored by a community of equals, then we must also include the truths and perspectives of other cultures, different classes, and genders. And if we accept that we can only know what science tells us, then we must also accept that there is no view from nowhere as a starting point from where we can observe the world. We must always begin from a social context, and since this context always determines how we see the world, it also determines what we do not see. Postmodernism is therefore more critical towards scientific results, insisting on including more variables, and can thus be said to be even more rational than traditional modern scientific thinking. It is also more secular, in a way, since it does not assume that we can obtain a godlike perspective on the world from where we can derive the ultimate truth, something that the secular and atheistic modernists, faithful believers in human rationality and scientific revelation, have had a hard time realizing. Postmodernism can thus be seen as a reaction against modernity's assumptions about the rational man capable of solving all of nature's mysteries, just given enough time. It entails the shift of focus from the empirical investigation of the objective exterior to the critical deconstruction of the, arguably mistaken, objective spectator's subjective interior, and therefore, if valid, as much of a Copernican turn as modernity once claimed to be. Postmodernism is still a rather mistaken concept, to a degree where many have rejected it as a meaningful term altogether. This is a shame. It has much explanatory power and can improve our understanding of the last 30 to 40 years of societal and intellectual development if we get our heads around it. To alleviate this, it may prove useful to approach the matter in a rather alternative way, less analytic and more intuitive, to provide a shortcut to those of us who do not wish or have the time to engage in lengthy academic discussions. The shortcut that I believe can be useful to do just that has been provided by the literary theorist Ihab Hassan in the postface of the 1982 edition of his work, The Dismemberment of Orpheus, Toward a Postmodern Literature. Here he has presented a list of dichotomies representing modernity and postmodernity. Postmodernism is admittedly rather difficult to make sense of, but if we try to see it from the intuitive impressions we can obtain from Hassan's dichotomies that follow, it might give us a clearer picture. The original list is a bit longer, but for brevity I have chosen the pairs I find most relevant and easy to grasp. The purpose is to give the listener an intuitive sense of postmodernism, so please take your time and reflect a few minutes on your own personal impression. With this brief interpretation of Hassan's dichotomies, I hope the listener has gained a somewhat clearer idea of the differences between modernism, and thereby the rational thought perspective, and postmodernism, which I believe is a corresponding overarching thought perspective, one that poses a serious challenge to the modern mode of thought which has dominated our thinking for the past 200 years. The starting point of postmodern analysis is that what we experience as fact and truth in many cases is shaped by our culture and might actually be different from another perspective, that our language contains hidden assumptions that we rarely reflect upon but still influence our thinking and behavior, and that people live in separate conceptual worlds and have always done so. The most prominent analytic innovations to have emerged from this sort of reasoning, the new postmodern symbol tools to help us discover these previously hidden aspects, have been methods such as discourse analysis and deconstruction. These rely heavily on many of the new insights in linguistics that appeared during the early 20th century and contributed to a renewed and more critical awareness of language, how it shapes our worldviews, and the observer's role in the construction of perceived reality. The increased awareness about linguistic constructions, meaning-creating narratives, discourses, and a greater emphasis on the subjective have widened our field of vision and enabled us to more effectively make reality's complexity more discernible. A discourse is a collection of norms, assumptions, and conventions, the overall context or symbol world in which statements are made. This is often hidden from view and considered near nature-given and self-evident by the people within it. Discourse analysis has occasionally been depicted as the ability to capture and expose what has been taken for granted, as well as what is concealed by being commonly perceived as self-evidently true. It is a method to address and scrutinize norms and empirical material and view them from different perspectives. Discourse analysis has helped reveal hitherto unnoticed power relations that sometimes require deconstruction to be fully grasped. There is no clear definition of the term deconstruction, and it has even been argued that it is not even a method, but it can be seen as a way to critically examine the relationship between text and meaning and separate the two from each other, expose hidden assumptions and contradictions in the way language is used, and pick apart unintended and often unconscious implications of this. Our language can be revealed to contain structures that distribute power, provide authority to some while contributing to the oppression of others. Language creates narratives that constitute discourses, language games with specific perspectives that need to be picked apart and critically scrutinized in order to be fully realized. For instance, our language contains many concepts which are often defined through their opposites. We is usually considered right and normal and is automatically defined against the other who is different from us. Taken against man, woman automatically becomes other. Taken against Western civilization, the rest of the world thereby becomes other. And against heterosexuality, homosexuality becomes the other. Terms like these would often not make much sense without their perceived opposites. For someone to be considered developed or civilized, others need to be underdeveloped or uncivilized, and for something to be normal, something else needs to be abnormal. Postmodernism wants to clarify such often unconscious ways of thinking, which deconstruction serves as an important tool to unravel. However, postmodernism, as an intellectual discipline, is not so much a method to generate new knowledge as it is a way of understanding how we gain knowledge from the world and how symbols and signs are used to accomplish that. Postmodern methodology in academia largely revolves around how we communicate knowledge, how it is experienced by individuals, and how they, in this process, construct their identity and reflect it back into society. No coherent postmodern school of theory currently exists, and no one uses all and only postmodern perspectives, theories, and methods. As Callum Brown puts it, The way scholars go about postmodern theories and methods is more like cherry-picking, merely using the approaches they find suitable for their research while ignoring the rest. No one is therefore being postmodern all the time, but all postmodern scholars are aware of certain critical perspectives, tend to be suspicious of the authority and hierarchy behind empiricism, and view the idea of modernity and progress as self-illusory and ultimately a myth. The crucial postmodern insight is that representation cannot be complete, that we cannot replicate the entire complexity of relations between things, and even when we try, the signs used are just signs, not the facts they refer to. Only through signs, words, and symbols can states of affairs be represented, and as such, our explanations about reality remain limited to what our language is currently capable of conveying and our personal interpretation of those symbols. No one can therefore claim to be in a position from where a fully objective interpretation can be made. The representations can only be examined by putting the structured signs into culturally influenced narratives which do not exist in or resemble objective reality itself. Reality is therefore demonstrably unreconstructible. However, this should not stop us from making any representations of reality. After all, putting signs together to form narratives about how we believe the world works can be very useful, notwithstanding that what is considered useful is culturally determined and open for debate. The postmodern insight that reality is unreconstructible should merely serve, I believe, as a reminder that we should be careful and critical about how we portray it. Yet this reasonable, down-to-earth assessment of what postmodern thought should help us with did not prevent it from being used to relativize our perception of reality to a degree that went beyond the critical and insightful, and into the more absurd and philosophically ostentatious. Discourse analysis and deconstruction became increasingly popular among scholars and students within the human sciences during the 1980s and 90s, and as empirical truths were questioned and the ties to established scientific methods were loosened, much progress was made in uncovering previously invisible aspects of social reality. New important topics were brought to the agenda. It was shown that science was not as objective and free of prejudice as commonly believed. Systematic discrimination was discovered to remain widespread in supposedly equal and democratic societies, and racist and misogynist discourses that clearly contradicted the values modern society adhered to were exposed as rampant. These remain important accomplishments we should thank the postmodernists for. However, as many postmodernists within academia lost their foothold in empirical facts, and in their anarchistic rejection of all authorities refused to acknowledge any standards of acceptable academic conduct, much of postmodern inquiry soon became a hotbed of pseudo-science and pretentious intellectual swashbucklers, ripe with academic dishonesty and lazy interpretations of scientific scholarship camouflaged by fancy rhetoric. Einstein's discovery of relativity, for instance, would often be misused by postmodern thinkers to support their claim that everything is relative. The realization that our knowledge is relative, that facts are relative to our assumptions about what is real, was thus falsely believed to have support by modern physics. In this way, not only our perceptions of social reality were seen as relative to the observer, even physical reality itself was seen as relative. And if right and wrong were relative to the cultural context in which ethical statements are made, ethics as such was claimed to be entirely relative as well. True and false, right and wrong, all were just a matter of subjective perspective, the postmodernists claimed. This is somewhat true. However, to then conclude that nothing can be more or less true or false, that everything is just as right or wrong as something else, is an erroneous conviction which follows from neither the insight that knowledge is relative nor the theory of relativity. Unfortunately, such beliefs became widespread among many postmodernists during the 1980s and 90s. But the theory of relativity does not say that everything in physics is relative. In fact, a better name for Einstein's theory would have been the theory of the absolute, since the theory starts from the very proven fact that the speed of light, in contrast to all other physical movement, is not relative to the movement of the observer or their perspective, but is absolute. The German description that Einstein himself initially gave the theory was actually the Invariantentheorie, derived from the discovery that the speed of light does not vary. The theory proved that no matter how fast an object moves in space, the speed of the light it emits remains the same. But for some reason, another great physicist, Max Planck, came to call the theory of relativity, and it was by this somewhat confusing name that the theory became generally known. If one should at all intersperse the physical perspective into postmodernism, which I believe one should not do, we can thus declare that the theory of relativity proves that there are, in any case, physical, absolute and universal quantities and laws. But, as it happened, the theory came to be misinterpreted and was used to support the claim that the entire world is relative. If not even physics has fixed values that we can trust, then, in accordance with this particularly mistaken branch of postmodern thought, it must imply that there can be nothing in the world that we may hold to be fixed or absolute. It is tempting to suggest that a belief like this would make people overcautious about their claims about reality, but instead the exact contrary seemed to happen. Rather than limiting what could be said about the world, the relativization of all knowledge and skepticism of empirical reasoning opened the floodgates for an unprecedented amount of poorly researched and unfounded scholarship. The notion that everything is relative thus did not come to mean that everything depends on something else, but more that everything goes, especially if it complies with the scholar's political ideology. Consequently, postmodern thought tended towards the absurd and the presumptuous, and without firm and systematized rejections of the less substantiated sorts of reasoning within the postmodern sphere of academia, it became harder to differentiate between the more valuable contributions and the more nonsensical. Without any standards or authorities to determine what was true and false, just about anything could be proclaimed as yet another breakthrough in academic thinking. Who was there to say it wasn't? The critics of postmodernism would therefore have abundant material to ridicule and compromise the whole endeavour. As the absurdity peaked around the mid-1990s, university faculties were increasingly criticised for wasting funds on pseudo-science, societally irrelevant inquiries, and academic dishonesty. Postmodernism as a valid academic approach thus gradually lost its public and academic favour, which forced university authorities to shape up and more critically scrutinize their employees' and students' activities. It is probably from this circumstance that postmodernism by many is considered a fad of the 1980s and 90s that eventually petered out. This did not mean that academics ceased being postmodern, however. Fewer simply self-identified as postmodern in the following years. But even if postmodernism as a concept lost favour, it did not mean that intellectual life became any less postmodern. Postmodernism was, after all, not a rejection of scientific rationality, but rather an extension of it. As Derrida once proclaimed, the revolution against reason can be made only within it. The method to undermine reason would still be reason itself. Accordingly, postmodern thought, following its initial first decades of anarchistic and highly anti-hierarchical attitudes, was subjected to new standards of valid reasoning, commonly agreed upon methodology, and thereby became firmly established within existing academic institutions. In the same way that the righteous rebels of the axial age eventually established themselves within the very same structures they had once sought to overthrow, the postmodern academics likewise became part of the scientific institutions they rebelled against and wanted to tear apart. A few concessions were made to accommodate the postmodernists in academia. Discourse analysis and deconstruction became accepted methods of inquiry, and new departments such as gender research and post-colonial studies were established. But they remained subject to modernist standards of scientific reasoning and methods to institutionalize knowledge. The postmodern scholars agreed to make their investigations more evidence-based, and their wild ambitions of a more anarchistic approach to science were toned down in favor of staying within academia. After all, it turned out to be very difficult to achieve the grand ambitions of postmodernism. The dubious practicality of the postmodern approach to knowledge is perhaps its greatest weakness, resisting rationality with nothing more than rationality itself, deconstructing language with the use of language, and criticizing metaphysics without any new metaphysical tools to replace the ones used for the very same criticism seem very difficult at best, impossible at most. Deconstructing every meta-narrative without attempting to build new ones on their ruins likewise made the largely implicit postmodern ambition of being a new meta-narrative to replace modernism an implausible endeavor. What postmodernism primarily achieved was that it questioned our naive belief about the Enlightenment's project that, given enough time, and with a lot of carefully conducted systematic research in accordance with the scientific method, eventually it will provide us with the ultimate truth about the world. Its great accomplishment was thus a change of our epistemology. Our answers to what we can know about the world, what we can proclaim as true and right, are essentially what differentiates the postmodern from the modern worldview. The world itself, and how we go about it, remain more or less the same as before. What postmodernism provides to academic discourses is thus a precautionary principle and a greater humility towards our claims of truth, not so much an entirely new way of making scientific sense of the world. Despite its fall from grace in academia, it is not without reason that postmodernism has been and remains extremely influential here and elsewhere. One reason is its new insights about our understanding of how humans acquire knowledge about the world. Discourse analysis and deconstruction have proved very effective analytic tools to shed light on this. Another reason is, of course, the many topics postmodern thought has brought to the intellectual and political agenda, such as racial and gender equality, criticism of norms, and the unfortunate consequences of technological progress and economic growth. A main reason why this has made postmodernism so influential, perhaps more than the analytic methods themselves, is that they can empower people who feel oppressed by modern society. Armed with postmodern ideas, previously marginalized groups can make their voices heard and thus be able to more effectively criticize modern society. This, however, is not all. A secret to postmodernism's success, one that is rarely talked about, is the argumentative power that can be obtained from it. Not only has the postmodern thought perspective empowered modernity's adversaries by virtue of new ideologies to address various minority issues, it has also made people feel empowered by providing them the means to win the argument. Despite being a minority, and despite not having any clear alternatives to replace modern society, postmodernists have tended to come out on top in discussions with their modernist opponents, much to the annoyance of the latter. But what is it exactly that makes the postmodernists, at least the more skillful of them, capable of gaining the upper hand in discussions with the advocates of modern mainstream society? When listening to such discussions, it is often apparent that modernists are ethically on thin ice compared to the postmodernists. It is usually the former who have to excuse themselves or explain why the things they have said have been misunderstood or taken out of context, that they did not mean what they said, and that they in fact adhere to the ethical principles of the postmodernists, even though they often only talk about how they are against racism, gender inequality, and similar things when confronted by claims that they aren't. But ethics is not the only argumentative advantage of postmodernism. Postmodernists also have a secret ace up their sleeve on an analytic level. This often manifests itself in the way they manage to entangle modernists and others in semantic language games the latter cannot escape from without losing the argument. But what actually goes on when this happens? It is not only because postmodernists tend to have greater knowledge about gender, racial, and environmental issues. One of the foremost insights of postmodernism is, as mentioned, that signs always refer to other signs and that signs are context-dependent. Remember the way Nietzsche asserted that there are no facts in themselves, it is always necessary to begin by introducing a meaning in order that there can be a fact, and that there is no view from nowhere, as stated by Nagel, that our perception of reality is determined by our own private and cultural context. So, when postmodernists win discussions on factual matters, it is often not just by questioning the facts themselves, but rather by questioning the context the facts are situated within. For instance, if someone defends the accomplishments of technological progress, the postmodernist is quick to put the cultural context that determines what is considered good and desirable into question. And if someone argues that a certain scientific result is valid, the postmodernist can point out that it is only so in accordance with pre-given standards of what is seen as true in the first place. The validity of such assumptions about what is good and true are often difficult to establish without reference to a higher overarching context, contexts that are often invisible to the defendant of modern notions of progress and science. And even if the person to have landed in a contextual and semantic language game with a postmodernist is well acquainted with such contexts and competently can discuss facts and truth claims on the higher level, the postmodernist can always point towards yet another context and thus reach the satisfaction of arriving at an antithesis where it must be conceded that we do not know what is really true or good from the perspective of this higher context. Eventually, we always reach philosophical bedrock, and at this point, we can only make assumptions about reality that cannot be proven. Everything we say and think can be questioned, since it is located within a context which finds itself within yet another context ad infinitum. In a very simplified way, this sums up the postmodern approach to reasoning about reality. And because postmodernists usually are only concerned with the antithesis, merely criticizing statements for depending on unproven contexts and rarely suggest counter-proposals, they can thereby end up on top of the discussion and walk away victorious. However, the reason for this is actually somewhat culturally determined. In our current intellectual discourse, it is considered sufficient to merely reach the antithesis, and it is seen as fully acceptable that a refusal of a thesis should not be followed by a superior one to win the argument. It is simply okay to just refer to a context on a higher level of abstraction without discussing the validity of the facts on the lower level. The reason for this is probably the circumstance that most of us are unaware of what is actually going on here, that higher-level contexts can always be pointed out, and by doing so, the facts in question can always be revealed to rest on unfounded assumptions. However, and this is important to keep in mind, that does not mean that the statements on the lower-level context automatically need to be rendered invalid overall. They can still contain truth values worthy of consideration, but this is often forgotten when confronted with a higher-level context. Pointing out that scientific research is merely based on human-made conventions of what are correct, culturally determined principles that could be different does not exclude that we can use them to accurately predict future outcomes. That gravity is just a theory developed by white males does not negate the fact that we can send a man to the moon using that theory, or a woman, if we desire, and the circumstance that contemporary economics is based on models that hardly resemble the reality they seek to describe, and in addition are shaped by capitalist notions of efficiency and exploitative structures of division of labour, does not exclude that lowering the interest rate and establishing international trade agreements can increase employment. With a postmodern awareness of context, we can always question that our current understanding of reality is based on assumptions that we are yet to prove. However, this does not mean that we cannot make truth claims about the world and treat them as valid within a given context. That Einstein's theory of relativity proved that Newtonian physics was not entirely accurate does not mean that we cannot use Newton's equations to predict the trajectory of a cannonball. The equations are still true in the sense that they can accurately describe the motions of physical objects on Earth. In a similar way, our day-to-day experiences of physical occurrences as they appear to us should not be rejected as false just because they depend on the essentially unproven assumption that we are provided accurate information about our surroundings through our senses. Within the context of sensory experiences as a source of truth, visual information of an open door is simply proven valid by a subsequent experience of walking through it. This is not invalidated by reference to physical space as an illusion or the concept of the door as merely a social construction that only resides in our mind. Philosophically inclined postmodernists may have a bit of fun by questioning physical reality and our assumptions about it, but even they need to walk through doors once in a while. Part of the animosity towards postmodernism that seems widespread today can be explained by the human being's need for universalism, to create order and posit the world within a whole, something the postmodernists are masters of disrupting, albeit the postmodernists have the very same need themselves. They simply find consolation in principles and orders on a higher level of abstraction than most other people. For many, this constant questioning, which yields no answers, can be rather repetitive and tiresome, which makes up another source of conflict and resentment between modernists and postmodernists, even on a personal level. When thought perspectives clash, it is not just a question of you have your opinion and I have mine, but an ontological battle with hurt souls and devastated worldviews in its wake. Modernists strive to encompass the world within a cohesive system. This is how they create order in their worldview and obtain psychological wholeness. The postmodernists, in turn, strive to reveal the inconsistencies of the system, pointing out that it only exists within just another system. This is how they achieve order and wholeness. To the postmodernist, any undeconstructed grand narrative is a nuisance that has to be made away with in order to achieve peace of mind. To the modernist, the deconstruction of their narratives is a source of emotional suffering that can only be alleviated by piecing it back together again. Currently, no widely available measures exist to alleviate this conflict, and the result is that people live in separate ontological bubbles with very little understanding of different thinking people. Both camps, modernists and postmodernists, are, however, correct in their own ways. It would be unfair to declare either of them more correct than the other. There do exist systems, structures that can be empirically analysed and from where valid truth claims can be derived, as proposed by the modernists. But the thing is that all conceivable systems are merely sliding systems. As in semantics, where we can see that the meaning of words and concepts are constantly changing, sliding from one meaning to another depending on time and context, the systems in which truth claims are made are sliding as well. Many postmodernists do not really deny that there is truth in itself, but rather insist that truth and meaning are context-dependent, that every context is part of an even larger and more complexly assembled context, and so on in all eternity. The modern project's ambition to reach a final destination of truth is therefore pointless, but the creation of new knowledge need not be. Starting from the total context is an impossibility, both in principle and in practice. Every meaning-making truth is limited by its own context, but the number of possible contexts remains unlimited. There is always yet another context. This is what I mean by saying that the truth slides. Every time we try to cement reality and say, now we have framed everything within a greater context, it turns out that our new context depends upon another. But even if the system slides, this does not entail that truth does not exist, or that we cannot focus on a context and explain something from its own premises. In order to have a meaningful conversation about truth and falsehood, right and wrong, we must then admit that there is truth and knowledge, although these of course only apply within certain given confines. If we don't, we might end up in the postmodern trap, the inability to have any meaningful conversations since we constantly claim that everything depends on the context. By deconstructing the discourse, revealing that a context finds itself within an even more complex, more overarching context, postmodernists can deconstruct anything to which they object, and, like a child incessantly asking why, obviate the possibility of any meaningful dialogue. If we are able to show that everything is context-dependent through discourse analysis and deconstruction, others will find it hard to argue that their claims are universal truths. But this postmodern insight does not, as mentioned, constitute an obstacle to discussing certain facts within a certain context and in accordance with its own truth criteria. The conversation is only made possible when both parties in the conversation agree to the rules of the discussion and do not divert it by pointing out an overarching context without sufficient justification for why that is relevant to the topic in question, which can be rather difficult if one of the parties is so postmodern that they merely seek to reach an antithesis, i.e., exclusively wants to point out how something is not, instead of taking on the difficult task of explaining how something actually is. We must submit to the postmodern insight that what appear to be self-evident facts within a certain context only do so in relation to a not-so-self-evident overarching context, that facts do not exist independently from the context in which they are stated. Modernists who do not understand postmodern thinking tend to be provoked by this, in their eyes, uncomfortable notion, and often throw out the baby with the bathwater by dismissing postmodern thought altogether. They usually fail to see that the postmodernists have actually made substantive contributions to philosophy, culture, and science. Here it is important to think both and. Both postmodernist relativism and antithesis, and modernist totalism and synthesis. But the modernists fail to understand that they are on epistemologically shaky ground when they are constructing their scientific and societal truths. It is here that most modernists go astray in insisting on elevating linear relations to universal truths without questioning truth criteria or how they relate to the overarching context. It is by attacking many of modern society's established ideas and assumptions about reality that the postmodernists have been able to score some rather cheap points during the latest half-century, without trying to explain how the world actually works. They often proclaim that various parts of reality are now dead, such as God, the subject, rationality, patriarchy. Yes, even the writer is now dead, despite the fact that I'm alive and well while writing these words. Many postmodernists get lost in this world of contexts within contexts. This becomes problematic when they go from thinking that one context or a particular perspective is not the only or definitive one to opining that neither has any advantages or disadvantages vis-à-vis another. When the idea of the relativity of knowledge is erroneously transferred to the area of ethics, where relativism hardly belongs, we then have what can be seen as a postmodern variant of the naturalist fallacy, the aforementioned notion that we cannot derive an ought from an is. That we cannot say anything about right or wrong is arguably a fallacy, which really does not belong in postmodern philosophy that inherently is highly concerned with ethical matters. So, with a paraphrase of the naturalist fallacy, we can say that some postmodern thinkers tend to wrongly derive an "it doesn't matter" from an "it depends." That it depends on the context is an important insight. That it then does not matter is a fallacy as erroneous as the notion that science can give us answers to ethical questions. We cannot base ethics solely on empirical investigation, but it would be dangerous to make that stop us from pursuing ethical answers. Postmodernism's largely implicit view of its own pluralistic relativism as the only acceptable worldview contains some pretty obvious inherent incongruities. For instance, all truth is culturally situated except postmodernism's own, which is true for all cultures. There are no transcendent truths except its own pronouncements, which transcend specific contexts. All hierarchies or value rankings are oppressive and marginalizing except its own value ranking, which is superior to the alternatives. And there are no universal truths except its own pluralism, which is universally true for all peoples. These are, in my opinion, the cracks in postmodernism's armour that will be the point of departure for the next thought perspective to replace it. Postmodern theory can be accused of undermining faith in science through its perception that there is no reality outside language and that all knowledge is value-based, subjective, and uncertain. But when the boundary between fact and opinion is eradicated by philosophers, it provides a fertile ground for fake news, which can then flourish on social media. There is also a risk that researchers under the influence of postmodernism become uninterested in explaining concrete reality. Instead of trying to explain material inequality and analyzing economic conditions, the focus shifts towards merely exposing race, class, and gender discourses and social constructions of poverty at the expense of figuring out how to actually alleviate these ills. A large part of the postmodern project has been devoted to the resistance of all hierarchies and value scales, but ultimately the old hierarchies have merely been replaced by postmodernism's own. Implicit in this is that pluralism stands above absolutism, diversity over homogeneity, anarchy above regulations, and liberation above conventions. As such, a new value scale has snuck in. In its extreme form, moral relativism not only states that the way others perceive the world can be just as valid as one's own, but that all ways of perceiving the world necessarily are equally valid. I see the world in one way, you may see the world in another way, but both are always equally true, the postmodern logic goes. But if all perspectives are correct, there is no way of determining what should be considered better or worse. Hence, there can be no absolute values. All rankings of values, so-called value hierarchies, fall. The only correct way of viewing the world will then be the perspective of pluralist moral relativism. Since nothing according to moral relativism can be valued more highly than anything else, the question of whether we shall produce pornography or theatre, liquor or medicine, merely becomes a matter of individual consumer preferences and an issue for the market to decide. It is not even possible to value one form of governance as better than another. There is no way to determine what is right or wrong, better or worse. Gandhi or Hitler, Shakespeare or reality television, it is just a question of personal opinion and taste. Everything is relative. By breaking down every form of overarching, cohesive culture, a culture which we all share and take responsibility for, the result can be that in the end it is just I and my own ego that take centre stage, an emphasis on the individual at the expense of the community. Without fixed values, ideals dissolve into subjective preferences and the interests of minority groups. It removes any shared ideals to guide our thinking, acting, and collective ambitions. Moral relativism thus paves the way for the market's dominance in our cultural sphere, since that is all that remains to coordinate our collective activities. If we relativize everything, we end up with no fixed point, no overarching perspective from which to view the world. By attacking all meta-narratives, except the meta-narrative of the relativism of everything, we end up with a worldview in pieces without any cohesive narrative into which our observations, thoughts, and experiences can be woven. Such an incoherent, fragmented view of the world can cause a sense of disorientation, a world where we as individuals do not feel we fit in anywhere. Ultimately, this may result in a rather alienated human condition, the consequence of a totally deconstructed reality, without any attempts to build a new, better meta-narrative, may thus be the opposite of the human liberation most postmodernists desire. Today, we seem to have approached a postmodern condition like the one described in this chapter and the last, a condition in which faith in all objective truths and shared values has been severely eroded. It has liberated us from obsolete ideologies and religions, but in the void to have emerged, many have lost the guidance and comforting social context that the narratives of yesteryear used to provide. Reality has become fluid, unpredictable, and all boundaries have been loosened. Some find empowerment and freedom in this, but many feel deprived of a steady anchoring in existence and a source of meaning and motivation. The postmodern human is both rootless and restless. Life is constantly in a state of flux with shifting roles. This has liberated the individual, but also weakened the collective, as life has become an individual project where we continuously have to create our own identity and reality. Each and every person is the maker of their own happiness, and no one should submit themselves to the opinions of others, but at the same time, our shared culture and symbol world has been impoverished and reduced to the only common symbol language that we all share: money. As an unintended consequence, the postmodern thought perspective has thereby opened the way for the market to become our highest authority. In a world where no authorities are considered valid for all, the market forces are all that remain.